my definition of extremism is a variation of an extremist scholar named J.M. Berger's definition, which is it's a ideology that's predicated on taking hostile action or violence towards any group that you don't like. So it's not only I believe in X, Y, and Z, or I believe that your group is bad, but I believe that I need to take hostile action or violent action against you in order to preserve my group and enact my vision for the society that I want.
Super stoked to have you here, sir. How are things up in Oregon?
Great. Thanks so much, Mark. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a beautiful day here, actually, in Toledo, Washington. Beautiful fall day, so happy to have this conversation with you, man.
I love those crisp fall days in the Pacific Northwest, man. It's just stunningly beautiful.
It's the best.
Well, I'm excited you joined me. We just met recently when I reached out to you after reading, I guess, an article in Integral Institute's kind of newsletter or whatever about your fascination with ideology and creating kind of like a post-liberal, post-conservative framework for a new political discourse, and something I really, really share with you. And I think it's important to, have those conversations, and also to help, in terms of this recording, to help our listeners maybe with some tools and new thinking about how do we engage and not just get sucked right into the battleground of us versus them, or my side versus your side, which is where everyone is. It's such a low level of operating in discourse. But before we get to kind of your philosophy and your ideology there, or your methodology, I should say, to give us a little idea of like what shaped Ryan. Like, I know you're from Hawaii. What was your childhood like, and what were some of the forces that shaped you, your parents and education and all that?
Sure, yeah. Well, I had a very unique upbringing. I grew up on the Big Island of Hawaii on the Kona side. My mom is a Buddhist minister, so I grew up in a Japanese Zen Buddhist temple called Daifukuji on the sunny side of Kona, and it was definitely a unique upbringing.
You actually lived at the temple?
Yeah, so our house was like on the side of the temple. Yeah, so it was all one building, and I grew up in that community. And so from an early age was exposed to meditation and Eastern philosophy and religion, and kind of took an interest in that kind of stuff early on. And for most of my teenage and early adult life, I was focused a lot on meditation and spirituality and going to India and doing yoga, and didn't know anything about politics or philosophy or ideology or really anything about how the world worked. Until I came back to Hawaii. I lived in Oregon for a little while, in California, and went back to Hawaii in 2014, and realized one day I was completely ignorant about politics and about, I still remember.
You and most people, right?
Yeah, there was a local election, and I asked my Dad, what's the difference between a Democrat and a Republican, and which one should I vote for? I was 22 years old when I asked him that. Now I'm 31. Wow. That felt like an eternity ago. And so I really started trying to catch up kind of from a blank slate. And I remember it was really funny. I binge watched the 2012 Republican debates with like Mitt Romney and Rick Santorum and Ron Paul and Newt Gingrich. And then I started getting into libertarianism and libertarian ideology and theory, and then did a 180, became a huge Bernie bro in 2015. And then when Trump won in 2016, I think there were different reactions, right? And the whole country was inflamed. The polarization was out of control. I had just moved to Portland, Oregon with my wife, and was like, oh my God, what are we finding ourselves in? And I think there were different instincts that came up around the election. Some people, I would say a lot of people, just kind of polarized harder to their respective sides, right? So the left got really mad and went hard left, anti-Trump. The Trump side was kind of worked up, and the right was kind of galvanized in a new way. And I kind of like stepped back. I was like, what is going on here? I need to figure this out. So got very interested in polarization, mediation, conflict resolution skills, started studying political theory and philosophy to try to get a deeper look, not just in the more superficial fights and policy disputes.
This is fascinating. Can I slow you down here just a second? There's a lot of things I wanted to ask you along the way here.
I'm kind of going at 100 miles per hour.
I got to pin a few things here. First off, was there any push for you to become a Zen monk or minister like your mom?
There was some encouragement from my mom and from the community, and it's something that.
And were you active in the community, like meditating as part of doing the rituals every day, or were you kind of on the outside of it?
It kind of a little bit of both, in the sense that I was kind of going through the motions, being raised in there, but as I got older, building my own, personal relationship with some of the Buddhist philosophy and teachings.
Yeah, so that monastic life didn't appeal to you. You were probably too young anyways. You wanted to get out and see the world. I mean, that's pretty
I was really into it from about 18 to 21 years old.
You were?
Yeah, and then I kind of felt like I needed to go and mix it up.
Okay, so then the second question is, so here you go, you grow up in this Zen monastery, you don't really get much exposure to the world, but then all of a sudden you find politics and you're like fascinated by it. Where did that come from? I mean, is that a karma thing, or like
I think so.
That's fascinating to me.
I was telling my wife the other night, I'm like, I have no idea where that 180 came from. I still remember decisively though that pivot. I was driving in the car and in 2014 and feeling a shift from being more inwardly focused and more contemplatively focused to being more externally focused and thinking, how can I make a change and impact in the world? And politics became very interesting to me, so I kind of went all in on that.
It's interesting. I think 2016 and beyond has really done that for a lot of people, right? It's like a lot of people who are kind of in a spiritual path, they think it's really about finding peace in myself, which it is, and creating my world to be a better world, which it is. But to do that divorced from the realities of the world and not, if you're willing and able, or if you're able, you should be willing to get out in the world and bring your gifts to the world. I think that's where you find the most growth spiritually, not by hiding from it, not becoming a mendicant or a monk.
Totally agree.
And this is the time and place to do that, right? This stage of humanity's development, I don't know about your orientation, but mine is like in a transition stage. I mean, one way to look is we're transitioning from the Pisces to the Aquarius age, right? And anytime you go through those transitions, right, there's a lot of tumult. And we're also transitioning through the fourth turning, right? Based on Neil Howe's work, generational turning. Fourth turning is always the most divisive: crisis, economic collapse, war. So we have to be warriors, right? We can't hide from the world. Anyone who's on a spiritual journey or journey of awakening, like, we have to get out there and do some work, right?
Absolutely.
I agree with you. So good for you.
Yeah.
So back to your story. Sorry, interrupted you, but if you can remember where you were.
Yeah, no, that was great. Yeah. So, I mean, basically, I then, after having a hard time finding a job when I moved to Oregon, I did a basic mediation and conflict resolution course. And then from there got sucked into various kind of like a bridging or depolarization efforts and initiatives. And then got drawn into this political violence de-escalation project called Cure PDX, which is most of my day job now as like a program coordinator and manager. So
were you involved in the Occupy Portland stuff and trying to de-escalate that?
That was before my time, so I was not.
Was it?
Yeah.
Yeah, that was pretty wild, huh? So tell us a little bit about your work with, and you just told us, a Cure PDX project. What is the project, and how do you help bring people together and resolve conflicts in that project or through that project?
Sure, yeah. So Cure PDX is the name of a project. It's a federally funded and partly locally funded project that uses a method from the lead nonprofit organization on the project called Cure Violence Global. And Cure Violence Global uses what they call a public health approach to combating and preventing the spread of contagious violence throughout different communities and high conflict zones.
Can we just define some of these things too? Like, what's contagious violence? It sounds like a disease.
It's exactly what
the communicable disease.
Yes, exactly. So it's when we talk about the contagious nature of violence, the founder of Cure Violence Global, named Gary Slutkin, Dr. Gary Slutkin, he was actually originally an epidemiologist and became interested in violence in like a lot of major U.S. cities, and actually tracked socially how violence spreads in a pattern that's identical to viruses and biological diseases. And so he tried to repurpose some of the ways of stopping the spread of physical diseases like AIDS, and using those same approaches to stopping the spread of social contagions like violence. And so our project is based on trying to copy and paste that method to stopping political and extremist, ideologically motivated violence in the Pacific Northwest. And they do this through what's called the credible messenger or violence interrupter approach. And these are people who are in different communities. So it could be, far right, far left, Antifa, rural militia gun groups. It could be anyone from any sector of society who has some kind of credible relationships or trusted connections with their community members who are on board with our mission. And so then we reach out to them, we hire them, train them, and equip them with different skills, tools, resources, like de-escalation skills. And then they use these skills and their credibility to de-escalate violence or polarizing narratives or behaviors that can escalate to violence when it comes up in their community. So the day job is you just go and hang out with your friends. If you're friends with the Proud Boys, cool. Go and get a beer and go shoot at the range and talk story. If you're friends with Antifa, go and do your mutual aid service work in downtown Portland, whatever it is. And if something's about to blow up, you're positioned to calm things down and stop people from acting or escalating to violence.
Wow. That's fascinating. So I imagine those individuals that you're describing, of which you are one, are acting like a immune response cell in the body. To use the example of, let's say violence spreading like a pandemic, it's the immune response. So you're inserting like messenger RNA individuals who can then go target where maybe the source of the violence is and try to interrupt it.
That's a beautiful analogy. We've not said that, but I want to use that. So that's great.
Go for it. No charge. No charge.
That's exactly the idea.
Okay, so backing up, and again, explain to us how extreme violence spreads, kind of like the flu or like COVID. Like, how does it happen?
Sure.
Just people talking to each other, or like ideas are. I get that like fear can be contagious. I've heard that before, and like mass formation is another way of looking at people just kind of like following blindly the party narrative or whatever that they're aligned with, right? And so we see a lot of that going on during COVID, and especially during the violence of George Floyd. But just explain to us the mechanisms a little bit more.
Sure, yeah. The contagious nature of political and ideological violence is a little different, a little trickier than community violence because it's much more diffuse, much more spread out, and much more decentralized. So in community violence, let's say in a neighborhood in like the worst part of Chicago, a lot of the guys who are in that neighborhood, they kind of all know each other, right? So if you find one key individual in those neighborhoods, that person has a huge influence over everyone that they're connected with. Very different when it comes to protest, counter-protest related violence like we saw in the wake of the George Floyd incident, where our data scientists track that people were coming to rallies in Portland to fight on the streets, driving from like 5 hours out of town.
Amazing.
They would drive from like Spokane, Washington, and Southern Oregon to come fight people in the streets of Portland, right? There's even some talk I've heard of people joining far left groups from like internationally, like flying in from Europe, just because they knew that Portland was where to get your far left fix, right? So there are all of these like really crazy self-sorting dynamics, but the contagion is driven basically through cycles of retaliation, right? So there's the academic word for this is called cumulative extremism or symbiotic radicalization. And it's the other side attacks us, we get mad, people radicalize to my side, we're going to attack them back. They get mad, more people radicalize to their side, they attack us back, and now we're in a vicious downward spiral. So,
aren't we seeing that in a big way over in the Middle East right now?
Exactly.
Wow.
It's a prime example of that.
So let's just back up a little bit, and again, let's make sure we cover some definitions. Let's talk about what is ideology and what is extremism, so we make sure that we're on the same page.
Sure, great. So my definition of extremism, and it's really important to nail down these definitions so we don't use the label abusively or misuse a label, right? So my definition of extremism is a variation of an extremist scholar named J.M. Berger's definition, which is it's an ideology that's predicated on taking hostile action or violence towards any group that you don't like. So it's not only I believe in X, Y, and Z, or I believe that your group is bad, but I believe that I need to take hostile action or violent action against you in order to preserve my group and enact my vision for the society that I want.
I see. Oh, that's interesting. So it's not enough just to believe in an extreme view, but you believe that you have to act to protect that view and sometimes, act against someone who might be a threat to it.
Exactly, yeah. My definition of ideology, and there's a lot of different definitions, so after perusing a lot of the literature, I've kind of synthesized this definition. So ideology is a system of abstractions, like ideas, ideals, concepts, etc., about the socio-political world that are A, normative, in that they inform what you're for and what you're against. So it informs what you think ought to be the case. And B, are contested by people of opposing ideologies meaning that any ideology, even though the word has a kind of a charge to it, it's because there's social conflict around the meaning or validity of these ideas, right? So if you're coming from like a Marxist, leftist, socialist perspective, people on the right, like libertarians and conservatives, will disagree with the meaning of those ideas or with those concepts, and will disagree with the vision or blueprint you have of society and how you want things to be. So it's conflict at the level of ideas, at the level of systems or patterns of ideas. I think a lot of us have a tendency to crystallize an ideology because of this human brain's tendency to form an abstraction, right? The social world is so messy, so big, so complex. You can't observe society and institutions in the same way I can observe that the sun is rising or that the sky is blue.
Right.
So we need representations. And so these abstractions are the ways that we can represent or grok all of the complexity of society that we can't fully see or understand. And so ideology provides the framework or lens through which we not only understand what's happening descriptively, and I think this is where things start to get in trouble with ideology, where they inform what we think should be the case. It becomes an agenda.
Right. Yeah, this is such an important point. It's like, most people don't even pause long enough to recognize how much of their life is socially constructed. It's just an abstraction, right? It's an idea, you know what I mean? Like I've used the example before. If you get in a plane and fly down south from Kansas and you look down, do you see Texas? No, Texas is an idea. There's no like sign down there you're going to see that says Texas. It's just land. Texas is an idea. America's an idea. Money is an idea. Ultimately, time is an idea. You think about how different cultures experience time, how different species experience time. It's just an idea. It's a construct. So same thing with religion and political ideology. They're just ideas, but we take them to be, once we've kind of grabbed onto them and our mind is fixated and that mental model starts to make sense for us, then it's almost like anything else that it starts to calcify, right? It starts to get really, really rigid.
Yep.
And then it doesn't allow room, there's no space for any other opposing idea. And it's like the definition of sanity, right? Is being able to hold two opposing ideas in your mind and see that both could be possibly true.
Yeah.
If you can't do that and you're an ideologue, an extremist ideologue, then that's a dangerous cocktail right there.
Yeah, the word to describe that calcification process that you mentioned is reification, right? It's treating an abstraction as if it's a concrete real thing and making that mistake. And I think when someone makes when you know someone who's kind of polarizing and they make all of these ideologically loaded claims and remarks, and you have that reaction of like, oh, that's feeling really ideologically charged. I think a lot of times they're using ideological language and talking about these ideas as if they're concrete facts. It's as if the sky is blue. I speak about my opinion as if it's just the way the world is, when really it's an ideological representation or depiction of the world. Right.
I love what you say there, by the way, because you say as if the sky is blue, as if the sky is blue, but it's not. The sky is just the sky. It just appears blue. So it's also an idea to us, right? Even the idea of blue is simply an abstraction. Anyways, so yeah, then you get, this almost veers into a philosophical discussion. What is really real?
Right.
But we won't go down that hole. That's more back into your Zen practice.
Right, exactly. Yeah, it's a koan.
That's a koan.
Yeah,
right? Exactly. So I can see how important like systems theory and looking at things from a meta perspective is to move beyond the reification and to be able to get in the middle of, let's say, a couple reified parties who are about ready to go to blows. So tell us how a little bit about your background with integral theory and systems thinking and how that's helped frame your thinking along these lines. Sure.
Yeah. Well, I dropped out of high school when I was 14. So 1 month in Hawaii public school, I couldn't make it, and I quit high school and technically homeschooled myself. By homeschool, I mean playing a lot of Madden 2007, but other than that, did some studying, ostensibly, try to keep myself busy.
It sounds like you did a pretty good job, I'll tell you that. Well, I don't think we'd have having this conversation if you stuck with high school and went the traditional route.
That's what my wife tells me all the time, but I stumbled across Ken Wilber's integral theory through my mom, actually, being interested in Eastern spirituality and philosophy and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of Ken's, as you know, as we talked about, and I've interviewed him on this podcast a few years ago.
Yeah.
Extraordinary philosopher. Yeah.
And it was, as someone who didn't have a conventional education, I found at that age, the integral framework, right? These broad orienting generalizations, as Wilber called them, were very helpful to organize some sense of the world and reality that I live in. Right, I didn't really know where to start, and so that was a great big picture kind of overview that was really helpful in framing my pursuit of more specific lines of study like science or philosophy or the humanities and so forth. And as I got older, I kind of moved away from the integral framework in that I think I kind of imbibed or downloaded the spirit of it, and then I eventually pivoted to this more meta-ideological framework where the object of analysis really is specifically ideological content and ideological kind of patterns of thinking, whereas the integral conceptual building blocks, right, like stages of development and quadrants, I think that's still back in my head somewhere way back there, but it's not as salient in the front of my mind in my analysis of things. But I found the general big picture zoomed out view to be helpful to not get lost within one lane or one silo of thinking, right? And I think that's that's kind of the danger of the ideological form of thinking, is getting unconsciously caught in that pattern of thinking, where then suddenly you become very predictable. And instead, the meta-ideological injunction is to step back and reflect on the frameworks and how they kind of congeal or crystallize together, rather than just being trapped in it 24/7 and viewing the world like that all the time and acting from that.
Yeah. I agree with you. I found the state, I know Wilber didn't create the staged development stuff. He just kind of like linked the Eastern and Western concepts of stage development. Eastern, came through adult development and even some leadership development theory, vertical development, or the Western, and then the Eastern more through Buddhist and Tibetan and yogic kind of philosophies of, the higher stages, self-transcendent stages. But it's very helpful, and I want to get, when we get to your, MIP, Meta-Ideological Politics, I want to talk through those, the dominant stages. I think you had like 5 of them or so. And I have a 5-stage model in Unbeatable Mind. We call them the 5 plateaus. So I look at them as very useful as a map, because when you're interacting with an individual or organization, it's generally not that difficult if you understand the research and the philosophy to say, oh, this is interesting. This organization is is a pluralistic, stage 4 green meme organization, like a lot of people in these on the left side would be kind of characterized as that, whereas maybe the Proud Boys or this other right wing organization is going to be like we call a second plateau, protector, bureaucratic type structure. And so they're going to be thinking completely different. It doesn't make one right or wrong. They're just completely different stages or worldviews. So that model acts as a map, right? And so you can then orient yourself. Same thing with the 4 quadrants, right? You can look at a situation, an individual, or an organization, and you can generally, with a little bit of sniffing, see that their kind of center of gravity is in one of those 4 quadrants, right? They're generally, like individuals generally when they come to me for work as a client, are in the upper right quadrant of behavioralism, performance, you wanting to do better, create new habits and all that. Or they're kind of in this bottom left quadrant of relational, and they're kind of stuck in a relational issue. And anyway, so I went into a little bit of a rabbit hole there, which is probably hard for a listener to be like, I don't know what you're talking about, this 4 quadrants and 5 stages. And it'd be nice if we had a little map to show you, but you're probably driving anyways. My point here is that I find these very useful simply as maps, not as a destination, right? Just as, like you said, an overarching meta perspective that you can orient yourself and then kind of dive in and do your work from that perspective or from that orientation.
Yeah, exactly. And the chart that you were referring to, I actually didn't write that. That was Corey DeVos on Integral Life's summary of an integral interpretation of my meta-ideological presentation for them.
Yeah, so he drew that just from your conversation. Well, great.
Yeah.
You know it enough that we'll be able to talk through it, I'm sure, right?
Hopefully, yeah.
We don't have to call Corey.
Yeah.
So that brings me to, I'm curious, moving from kind of conflict resolution into politics, you made a statement that you're hoping to help evolve or even initiate a new way of looking at politics. And I called it, using Ken Wilber's term, post-liberal, post-conservative. So just frame that up for us. What does that mean, and what does that look like?
Sure. I think this could take form in a few different ways, right? So one is, as I always say, to me, the meta-ideological disposition towards ideology, right, where you're reflecting on ideology from a meta perspective that's outside of the confines of a particular ideology that you're examining. That doesn't mean being apolitical. That doesn't mean being neutral. Or that doesn't mean being a mediator. You can still lean right or lean left or have your stock of personal convictions from whatever you believe in.
Right.
But it's about engaging with those convictions from a meta disposition instead of always being lost in the weeds of them, right? So it's not about checking out of the system, but about taking action in the system in whatever way you sincerely want, but still available from a meta kind of background or backdrop of everything. The other tool I think is that I really want to promote with this meta-ideological thinking is to inject these novel, you'd mentioned like systems thinking or complexity theory kind of concepts into how we understand political and social issues. And my contention for doing that is that I feel like the kind of patterns of thinking, the mental models we inherit from our mainstream political discourse to understand things, right? Whether it's like a social justice frame or a morality frame or a traditional conservative frame. Well, I think a lot of these have their value. They're also very limited in what they can provide for us, yet everyone is stuck only thinking using these kind of patterns and abstractions. And I feel like they're not very precise to really understand the complexity of the challenges that we're dealing with. And so
what role do you think social media has played in kind of cementing those polarizations and flatlining the conversation to like just one position is, or my position is the only right position versus the world?
Huge problem. Yeah, I can't stand social media personally. I quit my Facebook a couple of years ago, and it's been one of the best decisions of my life, but part of the problem with social media and contributing to this, right, there's a word, right, they call it the race to the bottom of the brainstem. When there's such a massive proliferation of memes and ideas and information, what sticks, right? What gets clicks? What gets views? What stays in your head? It's all of the worst, most inflammatory, most polarizing stuff.
Which triggers a stress response and puts us in a mini state of fight or flight, which gets us, cranks up the hormones and gets you ready to fight.
Exactly. Yeah. And that kind of fight or flight response physiologically overpowers a zen, calm, rational neocortex, higher level response.
That's right.
Right. So it's a huge problem.
Yeah. Yeah. And also just the stovepiping, in 2014, like social media was kind of like going along kind of nice. It connected people. There was a lot of good to it until they gamified it through likes and shares. And there's been some more recent research on just how that literally transformed social media into this divisive kind of interceder, right? Mm-hmm. Into our, between us as a nation, right? Or as a world. It's like all of a sudden you have everyone, magnifying, throwing darts, basically, learning how to game the system to get more likes and shares. And like you said, it's the most divisive, it's the most negative, it's the most controversial stuff that gets magnified. And boy, I don't know how we're going to get through that.
Can I just share something that I do personally on social media? Yeah. I do this with YouTube. So as you know, there's a phenomenon, right, called algorithmic radicalization, right, where you get caught in a feedback loop where the things that you search for and click on, you just get more of the same and less of other things. And the algorithm will silo you, basically, and you become oblivious to everything else. And so when I made an Instagram account, and when you first make Instagram, there's all these like pictures that pop up. I clicked on one image. I think it was like a cute like animal cat video, right? I'm like, oh, this is cute. I logged back on. Everything was just cute animal videos. Like everything was, and I'm like, oh my God, like you just like from one decision. Now my entire feed is nothing but cute animal videos. What I do on YouTube is I have like 10 different Google accounts. And I compartmentalize each one. So I have a Google account just for right-wing media, a Google account just for left-wing media, one just for business. And if I want to get a different picture on my feed, I just switch the account. I'm like, oh, what's the right doing these days? On YouTube go the right wing. The algorithm just has right-wing stuff. Cool.
I wonder if there's any way to train it to be balanced. It seems like counterintuitive. Like it would probably break the AI behind the whole thing.
I think there could be, and I was in a conference the other day on some ideas on how to fix social media. And one of the ideas that I have is there's already some kind of algorithm at work that connects similar content, right? There's some kind of associational mechanism going on. So all we need to do is tinker it a little bit to provide a little bit of the opposite content, right? So if you're only looking at left-wing stuff, some right-wing stuff should pop up every now and then. And then also have enough space for randomness. So even if you're only searching for certain type of things, 20% could be random things still get in. So there's some kind of buffer against totally going down some kind of reality tunnel.
That's amazing. Now I want to, I found, even though Corey put it together from your conversation, I found that discussion or that from that chart about the difference, how different stages of development deal with ideology. And could we go through that maybe from the, I don't want to say the lowest, but from the earliest stage, more toward the integrative stage. You got the chart in front of you. Can we just go through kind of a high level description of the different ways an ideologue or an ideological conversation could go based upon the stage theory?
Sure. So again, I didn't make this, so full credit to Corey DeVos for translating this into an integral framework. So
Corey runs the Integral Institute. Super interesting fellow.
Yeah.
For Ken. Yeah.
So he says, so the red stage is self-centric. So its ideology revolves around personal power, dominance, and immediate gratification. And there's a lot of emphasis on assertiveness, dominance, and impulsiveness. So I think this is really kind of like a lot of the extreme groups I work with would be oriented at that.
In this red, yeah. It's like red represents kind of lower first chakra survival energy. We call it the survival plateau. And the colors are just kind of representative of the energy, right? And these are like energy system type things at an individual level, but also at a collective level. It's the energy of the group is kind of like red, and it speaks of like anger and righteousness.
There's like a warrior archetype, right? Like a warrior.
There's a warrior archetype, yeah. And it's probably good to point out there are pros and cons. There are good and bad, right? We tend to like just look at the shadow side, but like that warrior archetype and going and fighting for your family or your tribe, that's very much that. But the point is that these stages go through, become less and less egocentric as you ascend, And so at the higher stages, you're much more of a world-centric or even, like Ken says, cosmocentric individual, whereas the lower stages, it's like my way or the highway, right? It's hard to see beyond your nose, or maybe you used to be able to see beyond your nose, but circumstances are such that you can't right now because there's war around you or you have major crisis, and so you've got to collapse your locus of control to a very small circle.
Yeah, well said. All right, so should we move up the ladder?
Let's go to the second stage.
All right, so the second stage, he said, let's see, amber or group-centric. So this is rooted in ideologies rooted in tradition, order, and a strict moral code, right?
So like the extreme religious folks, right?
Yeah, I think it's a traditional religious kind of a worldview, and also like a law and order impulse, right? Following rules, respecting authority, adhering to hierarchy, and kind of having everything laid out clearly and plainly, and adhering to those strict moral and ethical codes.
So ideological discussion from that developmental stage looks like what? Rule bound?
Yeah, probably.
Follow the rules, you're breaking the law. Like, what would it look like?
Yeah, I imagine like breaking, I think there's a lot of emphasis on like moral sense of justice, right? So if you break the law, you should get punished proportionately. And
eye for an eye.
We need, I think the chief value is a kind of social cohesion, right? And law and order is the way of maintaining that social cohesion. And I think the ultimate allergy here is a fear of anarchy and disorder.
Right.
So both legally, like the kind of conservative law and order framework, and religiously, right, there's kind of these biblical or Quranic codes and strictures on a cultural level provide the set of strong regulations to militate against the slipping into chaos and nihilism.
Right. And the chaos and nihilism is represented in the red.
Survivor
extreme mode, who's trying to break that down.
Yeah. Interestingly,
in fact, you could see that probably a preponderance of individual who are engaged in ideological discussions or action are in these two stages, it seems like.
There's a lot of mixing of the two in my work.
Yeah. Oh, interesting. I bet there is.
So
what's next?
What's next? He says, orange, self-determining. Okay, so ideology is shaped by science, reason, and individual achievement. So I think this is ideologically tend to be like atheist groups who are very into science, probably very skeptical or condemning of traditional religion and tradition in general, and put a huge priority on the value of human reason and the power of reason and science and empirical processes to make decisions and to form society. So not relying on dogmas and past.
This is the trust the science class.
Trust the science. Facts don't care about your feelings, as Ben Shapiro would say, right? Right. Facts are primary.
Right. That's awesome. So yeah, I can see how now we're getting into kind of like government experts, even experts involved in crisis management and conflict resolution, right? Need to have kind of this perspective or come from this perspective. There's considerable training involved and certifications and degrees and all that.
Exactly. I think the ideological school that probably comports best with this chart is like classical liberalism as an ideology, right? Valuing free speech, viewpoint diversity, and critical thinking, right? And an empirical approach.
Right. Fascinating.
Yeah.
Okay, so beyond this, we have the green meme, right?
Yeah.
The fourth stage.
So he says green, which is interesting. He says green is self-questioning. So it says this values diversity, equality, and environmental sustainability, and a strong emphasis on social justice and compassion, right? So I think it's what do they call them? Like the cultural creatives are like the group, and the political ideologies associated with this variants of postmodernism and critical theory, right? Where we're seeing a proliferation of DEI and diversity and inclusion and racial justice and pro-LGBTQ, feminist, environmental, and these kind of different movements tend to cluster together in a similar valence that we're calling here green or postmodern.
The green postmodern. Yeah, and I think that all you can see how the movement is to be more inclusive. The shadow side of this meme, of this green or fourth stage, is in a movement to be more exclusive, you become inclusive, you become exclusive, because it becomes you're back to the us versus them, right? My ideology, like critical race theory, that says everyone who is white is part of the problem, suddenly excludes everyone who's white from the discussion.
Yeah.
So it's problematic, right?
Yeah,
from my perspective.
The way that I've been describing my criticism of how some of these ideas have evolved is that there is a nominal value for inclusivity, but the categories that are used to determine who to include are all based on social identities, like race and gender and sexuality, not based on ideology. So we want to be inclusive to marginalized communities and stuff, which is great, but we don't want to talk to anyone who disagrees with us. Exactly. I think that's a huge problem. And so actually, that's a big problem. I'll just tell you a funny story, Mark. I created a training. It's called Cultural and Ideological Humility. And I led this workshop for various organizations. And the training is, the first 45 minutes of the training is very kind of postmodern. Are you aware of your cultural background? And ask people questions. There's a reflective survey. There are breakout groups. The second half of the survey is the exact same thing, except I swapped out culture with ideology.
Interesting.
And then to see how people reacted. And I still have a funny memory of someone who took the training and said, on the first questionnaire, when it's the same 7 questions, the last question was, write all of the books you've read by people of color. And all of the liberals and progressives are like, oh my, I'm so excited to tell you all of the books I've read by black authors. 20 minutes later, they get the same questionnaire. And I just changed one word in the questionnaire. Name all of the books you've read by people who you ideologically disagree with. Crickets. But the person said, hey, I realized I was so excited to list off all the black authors that I've read, but I couldn't think of a single conservative author, and I was proud of it. And that disturbed me, so I'm going to do more reflection on that. So some really good things came out of that.
Interesting.
Yeah.
That's neat. Yeah, it's important. That's what self-reflection is all about. It's like, where have I shut myself off from other perspectives and other, from including other realities, essentially.
Exactly.
So anyways, so what I love about Wilber's work is he said that as a generalization, by the way, there's more than just 5, stages, right? Some models have up to 14 or so, or as little as 3, ego, ethnocentric, and world-centric. But generally speaking, he says in this model that Corey wrote up based upon your conversation with him, the 5th stage of the integrator, or, there's different terms that are he probably uses a different term, that Teal stage is where you really are truly you've moved beyond the egoic structures that limit and exclude, and you truly become really able or capable of holding, multiple perspectives as possibly true, right? And that's that integral kind of perspective. So let's talk about, what does Corey say about that, and let's kind of like ping on that for a little bit.
Sure. So let's see. Teal, self-actualizing. At this stage, there's a synthesis of the previous stages, recognizing the value in each while transcending their limitations. It emphasizes holistic thinking and integration of diverse viewpoints.
Basically what I said, but in a lot fewer words.
Yeah, and I don't think there's a mainstream ideology that represents this. Yeah, and one of the things I think that one of the things I'm promoting with meta-ideological politics, as you had mentioned, like critical race theory as an example, is to, if there's a school of thought that we don't like or we think are problematic, one of my encouragements, and we can experiment in, how do we reread some of these ideas, right? We can reread some of the books by Derek Bell or Kimberly Crenshaw and reinterpret some of the ideas that have been interpreted in a kind of toxic or polarizing or divisive way. And how can we experiment with deriving new value from them when we plug them into a different framework completely? And the philosophical word for this is called creative abduction. And that basically means looking at something through a new framework or through a new lens to basically still honor the integrity of those original ideas, but to reframe them in a way that's just of a higher quality or more accurate in actually depicting the affairs of society. So just as a quick example, there's a concept from that's often used in complexity science called power law distribution, or Pareto distribution, 80-20 distribution. And it's scientifically studied how over time systems tend to accumulate in a trajectory with what's called path dependence. And path dependence basically means you get more of one thing and less of another thing. The rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And if there isn't a conscious attempt to kind of intervene to create a more equal playing field, then you will have a large amount of inequality that kind of compounds over time, in which people who got left behind don't really have a strong chance of getting back into playing the game. And so there's a mathematical way you can study this. And I've been experimenting, and some other guys have been experimenting with rereading a lot of critical theory and Marxist literature with a complexity lens and deriving whole new insights that we can operationalize in a way that's not a fundamentalist Soviet Union, kind of a way.
Right.
So that to me is kind of the part of meta-ideology too, is reinterpreting and rereading old ideas. One of my favorite quotes is, if you want a new idea, read an old book. Interesting.
Yeah. It's fascinating way you're talking about that. I was thinking, taxes weren't really introduced into this world until 1917, so less than 100, just a little over 100 years old, right? And I think the initial taxes were like 3% or some ridiculously low amount. And there was quite a bit of income inequality at the time. But now you fast forward to 100 years and taxes are like, 40, 50%, if you're in a state like me in California, and at the top of the income tax bracket, both federally here with all the sales and income property taxes. Holy schmoly, it's like 60 or could be close to 70% of your income. And all that is meant to support government and social programs to reduce income inequality and create more justice. And what do we have in the world? We have even more income inequality and less social justice. So where does all the money go? Maybe the whole model is broken, right?
Yeah. Well, I think what you've hit on, there are different kind of accumulations, right? Well, I think what you're alluding to is kind of a bureaucratic creeping effect, right? Where initially it's like, we just need to borrow 3% taxes to fund the Civil War or whatever. And then years and years later, that just keeps on snowballing and snowballing. So I think we need different analytic tools to be able to critique how these things tend to snowball and creep and expand from their original goal, and then being able to really intelligently cut it back and reduce it, right? And being mindful of different unintended consequences. So it's just more complex from a systemic thinking I'm trying to promote with this model than just purely dogmatic ideological thinking.
So when are you going to write the book, Ryan?
I think when I get more sleep and when I'm not working 50 hours a week. So I'm chipping.
I'm going to hold you to that. You need to write this book, and then you need to put the theories to test by running for at least some local office and cutting your teeth. Get involved in the politics where the game is being played.
It's funny because I used to always have a dream of wanting to take these ideas into a campaign and really test them by running for office. And the more involved I got in politics, the more I'm like, heck no. That's the last thing I want to do.
You and I share that. I have had so many people say, "Hey, Mark, you need to run for office." I'm like, "No, thank you."
No. My wife would also kill me.
It's such a toxic environment. It would probably
so toxic.
It'd probably explode.
Yeah. I mean, I always think, if I ran a campaign that was really based on these principles, you'd probably meet some pretty cool allies along the way.
Yeah.
But other than that, it's hard to have them stick in the mainstream
right.
climate that we live in.
Well, then you need to be a teacher, right? So you need to get this into book form and course form and help teach next generation of politicians so they can become post-conflict, right? Like, let's have open dialogue and let's share ideas and let's find out what's, let the best idea survive. You know what I mean? Survival of the best idea, not the best person. That's what we need.
Oh, I like
we need
that.
in America to get to this place where we can start talking again and thinking long term. Like, we don't have conversations like you would even in a corporation. We're like, what do we want to look like in 20 years, right? I don't see, we just like swing wildly back and forth depending upon who's in the office, and then we're just playing whack-a-mole with all of our crises going on. So
there was a comedian that my wife likes named Dustin Nickerson, and he has a few jokes about going from Trump to Biden and back to Trump. He said going from Trump to Biden is like going from cocaine to Ambien. And then he said it's like choosing, both of them are like in their 80s, right? Oldest guys ever running for president. He's like, it's like choosing between your old grandpa, hanging out with your old grandpa, either the grandpa that gaslights you or the grandpa that leaves the gas stove on.
That's exactly
it's really funny.
Oh God, it looks like we might have to deal with it all again. Let's hope not. All right, Ryan. Well, man, thanks so much for this conversation. I really appreciate it. I appreciate you and the work you're doing, especially on the ground up in Oregon. But I really can't wait for you to get these ideas kind of like packaged and to read your book and let me know how I can help with that. If I hold you accountable, I'll do it.
Please do. Yeah. Thank you so much, Mark, for the opportunity, the platform. Wonderful to talk to you, man.
Likewise. Take care, brother.